what we're going to be talking about is peak performing individuals. So it's the individuals who make up that team. And, this is a topic that both leaders and individuals will find interesting because this is a very personal component. Yeah, this is at that individual level, literally in the name. And so, I'm going to start off, David, by the question that I came in thinking about is, are people born as peak performers, as top performers? Is that an inherent thing within them, or do they become peak performers over time?
Yeah, super question. So I suppose that my answer is that I hope people will receive it as good news. There is good news here. Peak performers are definitely not born. Peak performers are made, and they make themselves with the support and counsel of others. If you think about it, I would say when you look out, even people who, however you're defining it, are currently performing really, really well in whatever walk of life they're in, all of us have untapped performance within us. And in defining, if I use the word performance very deliberately, you'll hear people talk about untapped potential. That's the more usual phrase. I talk about untapped performance because performance is made up of two components. One which we generally talk about a lot and one which really gets ignored, but we can learn a lot about from the sports world. So performance is made up of potential, and I would say nearly all of us have untapped potential, but it's also made up of, or rather limited by, interferences, things that get in the way of that potential delivering a full performance.
Yep.
Put simply, we can put it in an equation, Rohit. And in sports, we use this a lot. That performance equals potential minus interferences. And if I think about the corporate world, we probably talk a lot about and do a lot around leveraging potential, building knowledge, building experience, creating opportunities for people, giving people coaching, and so on. But what we tend not to do much, I don't think we could learn a lot from our friends in the world of sport, is really understand and do work around limiting our interferences. And only by unlocking both can you get to peak performance.
I love that. And just for the audience, I know I love equations, so you didn't just develop this equation for my benefit. This is actually, as you said, but I love it because it makes me understand it a lot better, and hopefully for the audience as well. So it's if I was to variabilize it, is it performance equals potential minus interference? So capital P equals small p minus small I for visual folks. Okay, that's cool. I think I'm on my way. I'm on my way to some sort of, higher performance. God knows it's taken a while. With that said, David, two questions come up. One is when you speak of interference, what does that look like? What is that? Where is that coming from? Because I think I understand, some elements of it instinctively when you say that, inhibitions, reluctance, inner friction, those thoughts that sort of say you can't do it and they manifest all the time. So is that what it is, or is it something else? And the second piece is when you speak about in the sports world, can you share some examples of when it manifests or it has manifested and how those who are peak performers, what do they do with it? So perhaps the second one is more of a longer conversation in the entirety of this episode, but in any direction you want to take, I'd love to hear your thoughts on those two questions.
Yeah, sure. So yes, interference largely you would define as, if anyone listening to this recognizes this, it's that voice in your head. It's those self-limiting thoughts. It's those fears that you may have. It's the things that way of self-belief, of self-confidence. And if you're listening or watching this with honesty in your heart, you'll recognize yourself in that description because it's true of all humans. We all have it to one degree or another. And without working to limit or maybe even extinguish those self-limiting thoughts, that voice in the head, it doesn't matter how much you leverage your potential, you'll never be at peak performance. Sally Gunnell, who was a British 400-meter hurdler, probably one of the most successful in terms of holding titles, one of the most successful athletes of all time. Sally was at one time British Commonwealth European, world, and Olympic champion. And just to throw in for good measure, she also held the world record all at the same time. And she had a voice in her head that meant that when she walked onto the track, despite all that success, despite the proof of her greatness, when she walked onto a track, she would look at the athletes against whom she was about to compete, and she would mentally come up with all sorts of reasons why each one of them was better than her, why each one of them was going to beat her.
Yep.
And her coach said to her, he wanted to find a way of taking the fear out of having to deal with your own doubts, with your own insecurities. Because very often for us to confront those kind of things is quite a scary thing. We don't often do it because it's a scary place to go, or so we believe. Yeah. So he wanted to take the sting out of it. And so he described to her, he said, it's like you've got a little duck sitting on your shoulder and it's quacking and it's talking away to you and it's telling you all these self-limiting things, these reasons. It's quacking away. And the lifeblood of the duck is your fear, it's your insecurity. And that's what the duck feeds on. And if you're not careful, you start to believe the duck. And so you become diminished as a result.
Yep.
And he said to her, all you've got to work on going forward, Sally, is you've got to learn how to shut the duck up. And this imagery, this thought that it was this silly little fluffy thing quacking in her ear, took the sting out of the situation and enabled her to really work on that. And it's a concept that I've subsequently adopted and use in all the work that I do. So you'll very often recognize people that I've worked with if you get alongside them privately, because they're all talking about ducks. But it's a super way. It's a way of taking the fear out of confronting something that unless you do deal with, you will never be at peak performance. Right? So you asked me about what we can learn from the sports world. If we take the golfer, for example, you stand on, and any amateur golfers listening will I think identify with this. You stand on a tee of a par 3 hole, and down the left-hand side of the fairway is a forest, which is out of bounds. The golfers will know that. Along the right-hand side is a lake. Between you and the hole or the green are some of the most horrendously deep bunkers you've ever seen in your life. And the green is tiny little postage stamp size with the flag just beyond the deepest, just on the green, just beyond the deepest of those deep bunkers. Most of us, when we stand on that tee, what we see is the forest, the bunkers, and the lake. We see our fears. We see the things that are scary about what we're about to embark on. The professional golfer sees the flag and taps into their experience. I've been here before. I played this game, this hole before.
Yeah.
What do I need to do? What club do I need? How far onto? So they're looking at facts and data, and they're seeing a razor focus on the object, which in this case for the golfer is the flag. They see something different to the rest of us. Is that inherently born, going back to your original question, in that golfer? No, it's a learned behavior.
Yeah.
It's a behavior that comes from quietening the duck who's just talking about the forest and the lake and the bunkers and the wind's going to carry it. And if you're not careful, you're going to drop a shot. And if you drop a shot and your opponent's birdie the hole, you're going to be 2 further behind than you were before. And before we know it, we've catastrophized an event that is not destined to happen, but we're creating that event in our own heads. The golfer has learned to quell that storm, to become singularly focused. The great lesson for the rest of us is that if that golfer can do it in that circumstance, we can do it in our circumstance.
That's really helpful. And I think that, however, the question that comes to my mind is that when interferences arrive, now that you've described it, and I'm sort of thinking about all the times when that happens, it's an involuntary, often, starting point where it sort of shows up, right? And not always, but often. And so for people listening, and we're talking about peak performing individuals, and where you articulated as peak performing individuals, the reason they become that is they're reducing or have figured out ways to reduce, minimize, even eliminate the dark that is the proxy for interference that's within you. But for those who are on that journey, right? So they're listening in saying, hey, look, I relate to it, David. I get it. I hear the voices all the time, but I sometimes it's too late. I can't control those voices. So what is it that where do elite athletes or corporate executives who have mastered the controlling of the duck, what does that journey look like for people? So people can say, hey, look, at a personal level, how do I get on this journey? Because by the sounds of it, it is a lot of practice, right? It won't happen overnight. And so any thoughts on how to get on that journey?
Yeah. So I think an important stepping point is to understand what's actually going on when these self-limiting beliefs or these voices come to us. Because you're right, it is involuntary. And it's because what is happening, we need to think about the neuroscience that lies behind it. Fundamentally, what's happening in these moments is we are triggered by something. We're either triggered by a fear that we have, or an environment in which we find ourselves, or by the behaviors of other people. These are the typical three categories that will trigger this process that we are starting to describe, Rohit. What is happening from a neuroscientific point of view is when we are triggered, there is a part of the brain called the amygdala. Maybe some people listening in will be familiar with this. And what happens is the amygdala releases chemicals. There is a chemical reaction when we are triggered, and our diminished response, our diminished behavior is as a result of the effect that those chemicals have once they're released in our brain. Fundamentally, what happens when the chemicals are released is that our neocortex, which is the thinking part of our brain, is disconnected. And what we are left with is the emotional part of our brain. So in order to break that mechanism, in order to return and put us on the path to peak performance, we have to find a way of re-engaging the neocortex, the logical, the intelligent part of the brain. And so you're right, the journey that you're describing is twofold. There's what I would call the longer term, which is around the more that I understand myself, the more that I understand the type of fear, the type of voice that shows up for me, the more I can head it off at the pass. And that is what sustains me on a longer term journey of peak performance. But at the same time, because we're all human and because none of us are perfect, there will be moments when the duck breaks through, because it's a smart little thing, and it will break through from time to time, even for those that are on this longer term sustainable journey. So then the question becomes, if it breaks through and the chemical reaction happens, which by the way happens in 6 seconds, that's just the physiological makeup of the human, that is going to happen. So then in those moments, we've got to find a way of, how do I recognize that in the moment and do something in the moment? So I'm on my long-term journey, but when the duck does break through, periodically, when I'm on that journey, I need to step in that moment and bring myself out of the chemical reaction so I can re-engage the thoughtful, the logical part of my brain. And funny though it is, for those folks out there that can remember either a mother or a father or a guardian who used to say to them when they were little, just breathe, just take 10 seconds, think about it, whether they knew what they were saying to us or not, whether they knew the root on the power of what they were saying to us or not, Rohit, they were absolutely spot on. Anything that you can do in those little moments that breaks into that chemical reaction, that takes you out of the situation. So whether it's just sitting there and breathing, whether it's getting up and switching the kettle on if you're in the meeting room, whether it's getting up and walking around your desk, any of these little, silly, seemingly meaningless moments are purposeful because they break that chain. They break that chemical and give you chance to re-engage and come back in a different frame of mind. And these are the two journeys, the smaller and the long-term journey, that many, certainly the those in sport that I work with, this is what we're working on all the time. It's mind management. This is the key to peak performance. It's mind management. That's what makes, on the individual level, the difference between those that are good or great and those that are truly distinctive. It's the difference from being a one-time world champion to being a multiple world champion. It's the continuous awareness and work on this longer term path and these moments that happen along the way.
Yeah, and you know a few world champions, so I think you speak from experience, having worked with quite a few of those elite performers. The thing that pops out for me, David, as I sort of reflect on some of the notes I was taking, was it's almost like and tell me if I'm misreading this, but it's almost like the wiring that we are brought up with, which is often focused on, as you said, the potential. Work on your strengths, improve your potential, work on building that skill set. Whilst that is true, it almost feels like, at least as I'm now reflecting on my years of continuous interference, that the training ought to be reduce your interference, because the sooner you can get to the reduction, you're actually going to amplify your overall performance and on your path to peak performance. So is it controversial to say then that, working on your strengths is not the best strategy, or am I going too far?
I would say, I think it's slightly more nuanced. I would say it's not the only strategy. Right? I think you should do that, because remember, performance is the maximizing of potential and the minimizing of interference. So you do want to work on your potential, absolutely, but it's not enough on its own. If that's all you do and you do it phenomenally well, it's still not enough, because the interferences will always reduce the power of what you get from your potential. So when I look into the corporate world in particular, I was part of it myself as an employee, as it were, for a decade. The frustration is that things like strength-based coaching came along, and that's terrific. Big supporter of it. But how are we helping people? How are we helping ourselves to minimize our interferences?
Yeah.
This, to me, this has to be, and would be exciting if it was the next big thing in people development in the corporate setting. Because I tell you, where I've seen it happen, what happens as a result is the level of performance from an individual is off the charts. The level of happiness that individual experiences releases an even greater level of performance than just working on minimizing the interferences does. And guess what? Organizations that invest in their talent to be able to do that have zero problem retaining top talent. High-performing teams talk about this kind of stuff as a team. They talk about their own journey to peak performance.
Subscribe to the People Quotient channel, where leadership meets action. Powerful conversations with practical insights that you can use right now. See you in the next episode.